everyone, what's up? I'm Kira. I'm a queer cyborg game designer living in Columbus, Ohio. And welcome to my channel. If this is your first time here, please like and subscribe. I put out videos usually twice a week about game design and my game design process and thoughts. So that's where I'm at. So this week I've been thinking about the concept of a queer fantasy. So like a game that is based around ideas that queer people might find fantastical. So inherently all game mechanics are political. You know, how you design your game and how you structure your mechanics, who the main characters are, who the villains are, all of those have some kind of political content in the real world that is easily mirrored in like the rules or setting that you write. So like a lot of your inherent political bias is going to subconsciously be placed in your game as well as hopefully consciously. So that's something I think about a lot. Like, what inherent political bias am I putting into my game? So when it comes to queer identity politics, queer is an inherently political identity because mainstream culture in America forces us to identify that way in order to survive, you know, in the political landscape, have rights, and equal pay and all of those things. If we do not identify as queer, show up as a unified body or whole, much like, you know, women or people of color, then basically we have to identify as those things in order to get equal rights. If we had equal rights, we wouldn't have to identify as those things. So in that sense, you know, modeling queer political identities in games is important because it highlights the activism that's inherent in identifying as queer in the real world. But if we're always modeling queer as political, then we're always modeling queerness in the framework of a straight world, right? Because, you know, queer identity is political and mostly only matters if, in a political sense, if we don't have equal rights. So that got me thinking about queer fantasy, you know, like basically games as escapism and empowerment kind of outside of the straight identified mainstream culture. What if queer wasn't a political identity in that setting? And so kind of things like a little bit like Call Me By Your Name, although there is some political identity that is queer in that movie and it ends on kind of a sad note. Dream Daddy is another good example. You know, all the characters are queer, but they don't exist in a framework or a world where that is necessarily political. It's kind of like, oh, we're just queer and it's normal. And actually my game A Cozy Den does this, I realized, because lesbian snakes are fantastical creatures and they exist kind of outside of any kind of straight normative world. Like, there is no straight normative world that they have to contest with. They only have to contest with things that are threatening their den, which is not oppression. So I think I just define queer fantasy as these things. It's a place where our identity is not politicized. We are either integrated and accepted with equal rights into the mainstream culture, and being queer matters as much as being straight, basically, or we are completely separate from mainstream culture, like separated onto our own enclaves or dens or communities. And there is a happy ending with no suffering at the end of the story. So I think that stories that have those elements would qualify as queer fantasy. This is what I'm positing. I don't think too many games exist like this, and I think it would be kind of cool if more did, because you basically would be able to you know, have this queer identity without oppression. You'd be able to role play, you know, power fantasies or just fantasies in general the same way that straight people do. And, you know, I think that while, you know, I'm writing a game right now that deals with oppression, and I think it's important to write games that are about resistance, I think that it is also important to escape sometimes. And the idea of a queer fantasy just kind of delights me. Just kind of like giving queer people a break, like allowing us to just, use our imaginations in a game space, and it doesn't have kind of any interaction with a queer identity or political identity. So those are just my thoughts about queer fantasy. Have you ever played a game that you feel fits into the category of queer fantasy as I've defined it? And what else would you use to define a queer fantasy? Let me know in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and follow, and all of that if you're interested. And please support my Patreon. The link is also below, and it will show you how to do that. No, seriously, it's really important. Like $1 or $2 can really help me right now. I will see you next vid.